Hello and welcome to the Upper Bucks Learning Event. My name is Pastor Brian and I serve as the chair of the Synod's Congregational Vitality Team, and it is in that capacity that I am coming to you today as the keynote speaker for our learning event in what is a most unusual venue for this event. So bear with me. This is the first time that I've done a keynote presentation to a computer so that you all can watch ahead of time. So hopefully you were able to find the link to this video and are able to watch this before we come together on Saturday. On Saturday, we will be coming together with a panel of folks that have worked around the areas of part-time ministry or multi-site ministry. And so there will be a depth and breadth of perspective that will be with us on Saturday for conversation. So I'm looking forward to being with you for all of that. But before we did that, I wanted to ground us in just some language and some context settings so that we all have an awareness and an understanding of what the current context of ministry are that we're seeing across the church, especially as it relates to how we foster a sense of vitality in congregations across the spectrum. So what I am going to present to you today is a little bit of some statistics, some ideas, some thoughts, some perspectives that will hopefully engender conversation and continued dialogue as we continue to seek ways to partner with God in the ministry that God would have for us in our communities. So I always like to start with this little tiny disclosure that says that I don't have all the answers. And a lot of people come to the Vitality team thinking that we have the answers on how to fix congregations or how to do ministry. And the reality is that there are no magic wands and there is no magic way to do this, that if you just copy and paste this program, you will fix your church. So what we do bring to the table, though, is the gifts of discernment and the power of the Holy Spirit to bring forth springs in the desert. So what we talk about today will look totally different depending on your context and your congregation. But hopefully, as this is the beginning of a series of conversations, it'll help us see and imagine what God might be doing at the margins to bring about new life and hope in the midst of despair. So let's get into it, shall we? So first, I want to ground us in a little bit of an understanding of what the current contexts are that we are seeing happening in the church. Should be no shock to anyone that church today is wildly different than it was even just in January of 2020. We are finding ourselves in a wildly different and new landscape, which is both a blessing and it comes with its own challenges. But there are ways that we are recognizing communities are beginning to infuse themselves with a sense of vitality and energy around what we call the three key relationships. So here you go. Here is the definition of congregational vitality. It is that we work to equip congregations and communities of Jesus to have life-changing relationships with God, each other, and their communities. So at the heart of congregational vitality work is the sense that we are helping people connect in relationships, both with God and with each other and their wider communities. So when we find ourselves seeing those communities that do those things, we see that people are able to tell stories about their faith and how God is moving in their community and making a difference for the sake of the world. It's a lot like what our bishop talks about when we say building the kingdom, the beloved kingdom. That's vitality work, is helping us kind of understand that. So that can be kind of wildly different than the way that we used to understand church 50 years ago. 50 years ago was more about belonging and membership, and we built what we called the institutional church with big Sunday school programs, and we filled the calendar at the church, and it was full of different programs that you as a believer could come and participate in and consume. The shift now towards the more missional church, or actually, here's a little secret, it's kind of getting back to the roots of what church really was. For much of its history was that we were the communities that helped people connect to Jesus. And so what we're finding now is that model of institutional church that we may remember, because it's kind of all that our lived experience of church has been, isn't necessarily working. So it shouldn't be any shock. The Pew Research Foundation has been researching this much since the year 2000. Is the steady decline in lack of participation in church attendance and participation across denominations. So this is something that Christianity as a whole is kind of wrestling with and kind of understanding what is happening here, that more and more people are finding themselves unaffiliated with religious communities. So the fact that we are declining in attendance and declining in participation and declining in money is not new to us. And so I find it really fitting that you all chose the topic, "We come together because we're not alone." And the truth is that we share these same characteristics and these same contexts with everyone who's doing church and ministry in the United States today. So these are not isolated events. These are not isolated trends. These are things that we're seeing happen across the board. But at the same token, there are those who are researching these smaller and sometimes part-time communities that are recognizing that they are actually growing and doubling in size. And so by carefully attending to what is going on in those communities, we can learn certain things to help us frame our context for doing ministry in our own places, wherever that happens to be. So I want to share a statistic with you that, again, part of your theme, "We come together because we're not alone," was eye-opening to me. So there was a research project that was done in 2018 and 2019, so right before the pandemic, and it concluded that about 43% of all mainline congregations, so that's Episcopals, Lutherans, UCC, Presbyterian, Methodists, all are served by some kind of part-time clergy. 43% of all congregations are served by part-time clergy. Now, when I began to research it in our own synod to kind of figure out what our synod statistics look like, I'll be honest, they weren't readily there. So I had to kind of piecemeal things together. But on my guesstimation is that here in SEPA Synod, about 30% of congregations in our synod are served by part-time clergy. So I know in my context that in Lower Montgomery, where I'm also the dean, I know that of our 22 congregations, 5 of them are served by part-time. That's 22%. Now, when you look at Central Philadelphia Conference, that has 16 congregations, 13 of them are served by some part-time ministry configuration. So that's roughly 81%. So it's here. We know that it can function for congregations. Would I say that it works well? I think there are some things that we could tweak and infuse with a sense of vitality to help them function a little bit better. But it's definitely not something that's well known. And so even as I was beginning to think about some of these examples, I had a hard time pointing to them because we don't talk about them. In the Lutheran Church, it's particularly in the ELCA, it's like a dirty little secret to talk about being part-time or being bivocational, or it's somehow judged and perceived as less than. And I don't think we should be doing that anymore. I really want us to kind of see that some of these part-time configurations and part-time creative ministry arrangements might actually infuse a deeper sense of vitality and new life because we're not beholden to old models of doing ministry anymore. So what I hope to present here is potentially some hopefulness. Is it the way we've always done it? By no means. Is it in line with our ELCA polity? Some of it is, and some of it might not be. So some of what we're going to talk about here is things that are being used as examples in other denominations that have different structures for their role of pastor. And so there will be some things that will challenge us because we are ELCA Lutherans on the ways in which we can do things creatively. But I think that the Spirit is moving in and among this. So I hope that we can begin to look at part-time ministry as something, as a gift, instead of the way our denomination has traditionally referred to it as the slow hospice climb towards holy closure. Unfortunately, a lot of people in Lutheran synodical leadership have often viewed part-time as that slippery slope to eventual closure. And I think it could potentially be a different story and one of resurrection and hope. But it means that we have to collectively get together and decide what those things are that we will allow to move forward and structure our newness, the new ways we configure these communities of faith to focus on the things that really matter for the community. So another trend that is happening out there right now that I want to lift up is feeding into the context of doing ministry comes from my time as a dean. So the deans in our synod help with mobility issues, and I also sit at that table. And I'm seeing a lot of transitions happening more frequently and a lot faster. So in institutional church, we used to say that a pastor would be in a settled pastorate 10, 15 years. Well, the average length of call in our synod right now is 7 years. So that means congregations are clipping through pastoral transitions at a much more frequent rate. How does that help affect our congregations? Well, it doesn't necessarily provide the stable leadership that we know leads to healthy and functioning congregational systems. So I think that's another dynamic that is in part of this flux that I will hopefully draw out and make a point in this a little bit later. And you can see the importance for congregational leadership from the laity needing to step up and into these leadership positions, mainly so that we can stabilize these congregations through these pastoral transitions. The other thing that's affecting the reality of mobility or pastors taking new calls right now is that there just aren't a ton of candidates. We definitely have way more open calls than we do pastoral candidates right now. Now, for those looking at part-time, we really don't have a whole lot of candidates to help shepherd these and lead these congregations, just because part-time ministry is not a reality for us. We as ELCA Lutherans have long relied on a full-time clerical model of our pastor serving a congregation full-time as their only job. We've not done a really great job of recruiting alternative types of leadership out there. So there's not a ton of candidates out there ready, willing, and able to be part of that. We've been kind of myopic in our understanding of what the pastor's role is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into things. But that's kind of the shifting landscape of what's kind of going on out there as we begin to imagine this. So I want to set some historical context because I'm kind of a historian and I love to remind people where we've come from, especially when where we come from is so wildly different than where we are. Because some of this stuff, there's nothing new under the sun. And a lot of what we can imagine about doing ministry is like going back to the way it used to be. And many of these configurations are at least hearkening for me the times of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg when he first came to colonial America in the 1700s and started organizing a lot of these Lutheran congregations into some kind of order. So circuit riding, going between places on a Sunday and shepherding many communities at a time is something that I feel is not on our too far horizon for many of pastoral leaders in professional ministry. So where did this understanding of the modern full-time clergy person come from? Well, it really has its roots in the Industrial Revolution, that as we began mass producing things, we did the same thing with the church. And so bigger and better and more programs led to the professionalization of clergy, and that was their only job. It was also the time that we started implementing a lot of our religious requirements for education. So, for example, it is generally expected that if you're a pastor in the ELCA, you have completed at least a master's level of training, master's degree level of training in order to be called as a pastor. Now, there are lots of different ways around that, and our candidacy committees are working diligently to try and journey with candidates so that education is not a burden to accepting a call to ministry, but it is definitely something that historically has been part of our requirements for becoming a pastor in the church. The other thing that the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the institutional church led us to was a set of evaluative procedures that would tell us what success looked like. And so we would look at how many people would come to worship, and we'd look at how big our budgets were, and we'd look at success as being able to support the structure for a full-time pastor. And we bent everything around that being the successful church. And that expectation still has its hold on our creative imagination, that when we think about success, we often think about being able to replicate those institutional church structures. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think it's really holding us back from being able to recognize the missional church that is rising around us. And so the missional church has different kinds of metrics. So I have often said the institutional church relied on butts and bucks, but the missional church relies on changed hearts, the gospel proclamation, and how many relationships you are able to foster in your community around Jesus. So it's a very different understanding of metrics. One old, the institutional model was more of a quantitative, and the missional church is more of a qualitative kind of look at what success is. Because the truth is you can be vital with 40 people in worship, and you can be completely unvital with 4,000 people in worship. Because if you're not attending to those key relationships, then it becomes a really hard time for you to see vitality in your community. So I think this might be an opportunity for the church to kind of really own that sense of vitality and think creatively about why we structure things the way we do. And it might actually be a gift to kind of throw all the things in the air and say, what are we doing? And how are we doing it? And why are we doing it? So the institutional church largely had two giant cost centers, the building and the pastor being the largest one on the payroll. So payroll and buildings were the two large things that when you look at a congregation's resources for doing mission, largely devoted to maintaining those two things. But what if they didn't have to be? What if we reimagined what those things could be and really addressed how do we do the mission of this community, and might not devote so much of those resources towards those two big cost centers? Because the truth is that we as congregations have needs. We need to be equippers. We need to be networkers. We need to communicate the gospel to our communities, and we need to be innovators. Jobs that we lovingly have now come to be the expected job of the full-time pastor, who may or may not be a jack of all trades or Jill of all trades. It's led us down the road a lot of times when we're looking for new pastoral leadership to think of this Messiah-like job description person who's going to come and fix us all. You know, we jokingly call that the Messiah complex for a lot of call committees, is that they have this expectation that is way too high for the office of pastor. So instead, what we really see is that these gifts need to be distributed amongst the congregation and spread across the whole congregation. And maybe the best way to do that, and we've seen this a lot in some of our congregations, especially when it comes to the musician or Christian faith formation or the sexton or any of these other office administrators, we've seen that we can spread those across part-time ministries. So what if a congregational system, instead of having one full-time person, had a team of part-time people that took different aspects of the ministry together? So I think that might be a model of doing ministry that could potentially be an option for moving forward. Because what we really want to make sure that we're doing in our communities is helping people feel like they are engaging in mission, that they have a place to belong and a purpose for what they are doing out in the world. I find it amazing how many people really grab onto the ELCA's tagline, God's work, our hands, and because people want to make a difference. And I have seen during this pandemic a lot of people engaging our communities because we're still out there doing the mission of God, that we're still out there helping the poor find food. We're still helping make sure that people have places to sleep. We are still continuing to be the agents of justice and peace in the world. And so I think how we do that and how we structure our leadership could potentially lead us to some really new and creative ways. So my question for this is, like, could there be a better way? Could there be a better way rather than institutional structure, collective memory that we always say, well, why can't we do it the way we've always done it? Might be pushing us, the spirit might be pushing us more in the direction of missional communities and partnering with God to see what's going on out there. So I do hope that there's a better way, that instead of seeing this as hospice, that we might be able to recover more vitality and more effective use of the resources that the church has gathered funds to create relationships with God, each other, and the wider community. And that maybe instead of devoting those resources towards outdated models of success, we might instead invest in equipping and experimenting with people so that they might be able to live out their lives of faith. So I want to introduce you to a resource that I read here this last month, and I found it exceedingly helpful. The book is called Part-Time is Plenty, Thriving Without Full-Time Clergy, and it's by Jeffrey McDonald. Jeff is a part-time UCC pastor and part-time religious journalist, but he wrote this book because he worked with one, and he's up in New England, which is notoriously not a very religious landscape. And so there are quite a few part-time congregations up there that are having to get really creative with how and what they configure for their pastoral leadership and how they tend to the needs of their communities. He's a UCC pastor, so he writes from that context. So the book has a lot of examples of things across denominational lines with Methodist churches. There are a few ELCA congregations that he highlights in here, but he worked with one of the seminaries up in Maine to write to the Lilly Endowment, which is one of our large funding streams for research in mainline denominations, for a grant to study part-time congregations that were thriving. So this book is full of examples of ways that congregations have configured themselves to experiment, to do holy innovation and good and amazing work to shepherd their mission and ministry in their context, given the reality that they don't have enough funds to support a full-time pastor. So I commend it to you that if you're in this space and thinking through what this could look like, this is rife with great examples of things that we could look at together. So I want to highlight a few things from the book and talk about some things about that were in this book. And then where I want to go is into some examples across the spectrum so that we can begin to have similar language together. So like I said, Jeff writes not from an ELCA perspective. So some of the things, even of the ELCA congregations that he points out in here, go against our denominational polity in some of the examples. But like, I think with some creativity, we could begin to have the conversations to begin to lift up some of these things. And I'm even aware that there are things going on in other synods that aren't happening here in SEPA Synod, but there's no reason why we couldn't have them function this way in SEPA Synod. We just haven't put those systems in place yet. One of the things that I find exceedingly helpful about the points that Jeff makes in this book are that one of the things that people stumble when they go to make these kind of configurations happen is they fail to frame it appropriately. And so I'm taking this to heart that as we step into transitions in some of these communities that are going from the pastor who retired at full-time level to a new pastor who might be functioning at part-time levels, we need to be very careful about how we frame that. And so that you must frame the job description so that it's not just like, here's a pared down list of what the institutional church pastor did, but instead work to really infuse that job description and those expectations so that they foster vitality and it doesn't just replicate the institutional church. I promise, getting out of that institutional church mindset is infectious. And it's so hard to do. I even find myself falling prey to it every once in a while to be like, oh, well, that was easy. We could just do it the way we used to do it, right? Well, that's not really being attentive to what the Spirit might be doing now. And in another process that I'm working with congregations, Dwight Du Bois often talks about it as the autoimmune response, that our body sometimes like continues to fight off the newness because we like it the way we've always done it. And so it's just hard to sometimes keep pushing ourselves outside of that expectation. The second thing that he's pointed out in his book that I find really, really, really important for us to hear collectively today is that this requires active participation from the laity to take on some of the ministry duties traditionally attributed to the office of pastor. Okay? It means that we have to distribute some of those duties across all of us. There's no reason we can't do that, but we, at least in this neck of the woods, have historically had very clerical function clergy, that there are certain things that the pastor is supposed to do. But again, There's nothing in our polity that prevents us from doing these kinds of things, like visitation or supervising education or worship planning, heck, even preaching on occasion, community representation at meetings, pastoral care, counseling, grief support, the administration of the congregation. These are all things that we traditionally bundle into the job description of the pastor, but there really is no reason why people in the congregation couldn't take on some of those responsibilities as well. So, a careful exploration of the community's giftedness, your unique giftedness as a community, might help provide guidance on how that we might be able to craft the vitality piece around a job description. The other thing that Jeff points out in his book is that this creation must absolutely not create financial hardship or stress on the pastor. So this has to be an arrangement that people willingly kind of take on, and that they're in a financial position that this is not a burden to them. The reality is that for those of us entering professional ministry who came up through that institutional model of going to seminary and getting a master's degree, there's a lot of educational debt that went along with that. And some of us have gone into professional ministry with the expectation that it is a full-time vocation. And so for our families and for where we are in our life, we may need that to be full-time. So we may not be in a position to entertain a part-time call or a bivocational call. So that has to be something that is in part of the discernment process for both the candidate, but then also the congregation to work to make an arrangement work that works for both pastor and people. So the other thing, and I'll talk about this a little bit, is that he presented 3 different kind of models for how that vitality-based pastoral job description at part-time level might happen. And he sees it functioning in 3 kind of essential ways. Some of the people in part-time arrangements function as pastor as equipper, meaning the pastor is working to help equip the people of the congregation take on some of those distributed job descriptions in the congregation. The other times that he sees part-time ministry working in the congregations that he researched was that the pastor was ambassador. So the pastor was functioning as that figurehead out in the community to foster those relationships with new people to bring them in. So there were people in the congregation taking on a lot of those other things and keeping the day-to-day stuff operating so the pastor could be out in the community more. And then third, he said he saw a lot of places functioning as pastor as part of a multi-staff, multi-team member. And so the pastor is one of those part-time people, like I said before, that might be helping to make sure that visitation is covered, that worship planning is covered, and that preaching is covered. So that might be 3 different ways that a part-time vitality-based configuration might hold. So I also want to say this, and he was pretty clear in his book about this. My hope is that this is not a threat to full-time ministry. And I hope my colleagues are hearing me this. Please hear me say this. This is not a threat to those who are dutifully working in full-time calls. We still have congregations that are big enough that support full-time calls, and you are doing good and great and holy work in that full-time call. But we are also recognizing that across mainline denominations, there are 43% that are being served by part-time. And so I think bringing this out to collectively talk about it and name it and claim it might give us the networks of support that we really need to make this thrive and flourish, so that it is not a slow dirge to holy closure, that these communities continue to be Jesus's hands and feet, making life-changing differences for these communities as beacons of hope. There are people still living in these communities, so why wouldn't we want to help make sure that these communities make a difference for the people living in their communities? Because churches step into that space when the community's support services often falter. So I think this is really an opportunity for us to stretch so that we can see something that might be different than the way we've always done it. But by no means, I think we will still continue to need the structures of full-time calls in our church. So I want to give you an example. Hypothetical situation in a distant galaxy far, far away, or in another iteration of this universe, my call story. So for those who know me, or those who don't know me, before coming to seminary, I was working in real estate with my mom, and sensed a call to ministry, really sensed a call to ministry since college, but realized that my gifts were not welcome in the Lutheran Church. And so it took me a little while before I took the step off that leap and into seminary. But the time that I was coming through seminary in 2007 and 2008, it was still under that institutional model of I was making a vocational choice to go into full-time ministry. So that meant that I was off to a residential seminary program, 4 years in Philadelphia, where I resided as a full-time day student and forego a job. Now, the structures are becoming more available and more readily available for people to not go down that path, but could have possibly taken me in a different direction. For example, what if in this alternate universe, I had stayed working in real estate all the way through seminary? In that same alternate universe, maybe I would be one of the people who would be called into bivocational ministry, serving one of these smaller communities where my everyday bread and butter was provided for by a real estate career. Well, that's a creative way to kind of put things together. Both would acknowledge the fact that I have gifts for ministry, but the daily bread that was needed could be provided by other means. Now, I know that I am gifted in that way and that was blessed to be able to have different careers like that. But I'm wondering, why aren't we recruiting more people like this to help them discover calls to ministry that might be able to serve in situations like this? So I'm acknowledging that we as the Lutheran Church have work to do. We'll talk more about work that we need to do in a little bit. But I give you that as an example to say, what if? What if these structures for helping support these congregations were in place for us today? So the next thing I want to do is talk a little bit about one of Jeff's big points of discovering the gifts in your own community. Now, this is a big piece of how we make this work for our congregations. A big part of making part-time ministry vital is being able to discover your unique gifted mission from God. So you've got to figure out the thing that you guys do so well. Now, remember, don't let institutional church creep into this, because the institutional church says you got to be everything for everyone in every place, right? We got to do it all, we got to be it all, and we got to serve it all. But a missional church is laser focused on the thing that they do really well. And even my own community is starting to wrestle with what that means. So the people of St. Mark's are starting to dive deep into that giftedness of what is the thing that we at St. Mark's do better than anybody else. And I would say that that's your unique purpose and mission from God for your community. And so helping to be laser focused on that and what are the gifted uniqueness of what people bring in your community is a really big important to that. So now, to discover that gifted, there's a myriad of ways that you can go through that. Some of you may be aware of things like spiritual gift inventories, when we look at the giftedness that we bring through the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Love, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, the gifts of the Spirit. Some of us are given those in exceedingly overwhelming proportions, and some of us not so much. But we all have been gifted through the Holy Spirit to bring about gifts. And that even includes the gifts of our vocations or our jobs or our purpose in life, is ways that we bring giftedness to the world and help people see that God is at work. So then once you've done that, it's also helpful to kind of spend some time, what I call exegeting your community. So exegesis is a big fancy church word that I'll teach you today. It's why I spent all that money on that master's degree. So exegesis is a process by which we take the scripture and bring God out of it. It's what pastors do in their office all week that you have no idea what we do all day. So that is a process by which we take an understanding of God from the text for preaching. And I think the same thing can be done in your communities, where you look at the landscape of your community and say, where are the needs? So one of the things that I find really helpful is to take an example of the Beatitudes. So if you remember from Matthew's Gospel, Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount when he said, blessed are the peacekeepers, blessed are those who persecute you and revile you, right? The blesseds. It's helpful to take those as an example and say, okay, where are those blessed people in my community around me? So for example, where are the peacekeepers? Well, who's your local police force, and who are the people that work around social services in your community? Who are the ones that are keeping us safe, and who are the ones that are helping people grieve? And where are the funeral homes, and where are the grief support groups, and where are the kids gathering for after school activities? And begin to map those out and say, what is present in our community, and where can we be a blessing among those people, as a way to kind of see where God might be already at work in your community. So those are all ways that we kind of take our giftedness and the community's giftedness and kind of begin to discover our purpose if we aren't readily able to name our purpose in our community. And then finally, with your giftedness, it doesn't hurt us to get training. I mean, I love to say that I'm learning about my faith each and every day and will until I see the other side of the resurrection, because faith formation is a lifelong process. It's not something we graduate from as soon as we finish confirmation, contrary to the way many of our confirmation programs are structured, that learning is a lifelong endeavor. And so I give thanks that in our synod, there are continuing education events that happen, both for me as a rostered leader, but then also as laity as well. And so I give thanks for ways that we continue to do that. But I tell you right now, we can always do more. And so helping to get training for some of these specialized vocations and jobs within the congregation might be helpful for us. So I truly fundamentally believe that we are writing a new chapter in ministry. And we are, in many ways, because of the pandemic, really beginning to see that our landscape for doing ministry has wildly shifted. There's no going back, folks, and this is going to be with us for a long time. And I think that as we come into this new chapter, I think naming the reality for how many? 43% of our congregations being part-time is something that we should name it. Because when we name it, we don't let it be a dirty secret. We name it and we claim it, and we say that the state of the reality of these churches is here. And we need to stop ignoring this half and start thinking about ways that we can cultivate vitality in them. So know that in the process of preparing for this, my eyes have been opened, and really beginning to say that this is quickly becoming a majority of reality for many of our congregations. So I'm hopeful that bringing these congregations out of shame and despair and create networks for them to connect to one another is a really important thing that we need to do in writing this new chapter. The challenge for us is that this chapter hasn't been written yet. And that doesn't mean that it couldn't be written, though. And I think that we will need your help in helping this new chapter in ministry be written. The other thing about this new chapter is please, please, please note that seminaries and pastors were never trained this way. Unless you are literally coming out right now, there are none of us that were trained as this being the foundational model for how to do church. But the good news is that I believe you can teach an old dog new tricks. And that I think that there might be some life-giving aspects of this part-time ministry that might be really helpful. So, but it does mean that even us, rostered leaders, the professional church people, do need to get retrained on how we understand and relate to some of these ministries. The other thing that I think about writing this new chapter in ministry is that I really want to call it something else. I just don't resonate with part-time ministry, because the reality is no ministry is part-time. It might be a part-time pastorate, but it's not part-time ministry, and we don't do this as a one-off thing. Jesus really calls us all into this work. And so maybe a better name for these communities would be things like a priesthood of all believer church, where we take seriously what is traditionally attributed to Martin Luther. I know there are some purists out there. But the understanding that we all have a role to play in the work of ministry in our community. Or another word for these communities might be a distributed church, where the duties in the office of pastor are distributed among the people. Or Jeff makes a suggestion in his book of a flat church, where we're flattening out the hierarchy in some of these congregational settings. But I don't know. Maybe there are better names out there too. But I think part-time ministry is a misnomer. And I really, hopefully, maybe in our collective conversations, we'll come up with a term for our synod to use for some of these congregations. So finally, in this first part, I want to talk about work that we all have to do. So again, please know that the ELCA has some denominational baggage to deal with. One of the realities is that we are pretty clunky when it comes to how we officiate this officially. So for those who have been in part-time and some of these not full-time places, know that there's a difference between a pastor contracted and a called pastor. And a lot of times we all like to see that we have a called pastor in some of these places, but that is a level of compensation that the ELCA has kind of dictated to us that at least 15 hours a week is a call. Anything less than that is a contract. And that division, for whatever it is with us. And for good or for ill, it doesn't have to stay that way, but it's going to take a lot of collective conversation in the church to change those and terminologies. We all have work to do to lift this up, that it's viable and it's not shameful, and it's not a shameful option for many of our communities. We also need to work at creating these networks so that those who are in these part-time spaces know one another and can share what they're learning with each other, and things that work and things that don't work, so that we know that, as your conference theme says, we come together because we're not alone. And so I think that's one of the great gifts of the Synod, is that we can help create those networks of connections, so that whether you're in Upper Bucks or Lower Montgomery or Delco or wherever, you meet regularly with your colleagues who are navigating these spaces. We also need to create those training networks. So some of the other synods actually have lay leadership development academies where they train up people to do some of these duties in their congregations, and that they become lay authorized sacramental administrators. They become lay authorized synodical worship leaders and are leading communities as the pastor travels from community to community each Sunday. That there are lay leaders in that place that are authorized and oversight by the synod. Now, that's an example that's happening in Upper Susquehanna, but is not presently happening here, to my knowledge, in our synod. Again, doesn't mean it can't, but at the present, it's just not there. So I think we have a lot to do in helping to retool the saints for the work of ministry for this new chapter of ministry. We also need to work at retooling our seminaries so that, candidates who are coming out understand that there is a spectrum of ministry out there depending on what's going on. And then the other thing that I feel like we need to do is we need to work with our candidacy committees in helping recruit some of these alternative models of leadership that might be able to serve in communities. I find it amazing that, millennials right now are all about doing the side hustle. So the side hustle is the side gig that I do to make spare money, right? Because we're all drowning in debt and we need to make as much money as we can. But the side hustle has become this new kind of vocation thing. So that's your Uber drivers and your DoorDash, or this part-time gig that I can do on the side that doesn't interfere with my life. Well, what if pastoring became kind of a side hustle for somebody, or something else they do in addition to? Somebody who may be a very skilled surgeon might also be called to be a gifted preacher, but because of their vocation as surgeon, and the way our churches have configured themselves in terms of leadership models, they would never be able to serve. And so I think cultivating that sense of call with a wider community will lead to fresh candidates for some of these communities. Now, that's not a quick fix, and that's not going to solve your transition right now, but it might be a way for us to live into this new chapter of church, that you, in your communities, might begin to look at people in your pews who might have gifts for this. Lord knows, and I've been out in enough churches, there is the matriarchs and the patriarchs of congregations, and they have gifts for ministry and have for generations been leaders in our models of churches. And maybe it's time to look at them and say, maybe for such a time as this, that you have been called into the ministry. So I think that is all stuff that we have work to do collectively as a wider church community. That's something certainly that I can't do as the Vitality team. It's not something that we can do as Upper Bucks, and it's not something that we can do alone in SEPA Synod. But collectively, working in the church, we can begin to have those conversations. So I think part of that is helping us kind of see the role as pastor as missioner or as missional presence rather than institutional administrator, and then our work as candidacy committees and work as the deans and work with congregations that are in transition to be able to see these kind of missional leaders that might be able to serve in some of these congregational settings. So that is definitely work that we all have to do as a community. So now what I want to talk about a little bit, and hopefully you have the handout, is to talk a little bit about what I call the ministry spectrum of all these different configurations of things that are out there, what's possible when we reimagine what our leadership needs are. So these are some examples, and this isn't a definitive list. It's just a way for me to organize and kind of give you a broad spectrum of what is happening out there in the church so that you know that there are examples of these congregations that are both working and have been working for many years. Because again, we come together because we're not alone, and we need to be able to see that there are examples of these styles of ministry out there. So on this, on the left-hand side there, I kind of talk about the situation or the context, kind of do a brief explanation of this, and then give some examples of congregations where that is at play. Some of those are in our synod, and some of those are not in our synod. So because we don't have all of the examples functioning in our synod. So the first category of the spectrum of ministry arrangements are what I call shared leadership. And this is when one pastor is serving multiple congregations at the same time. And one of the things that we have found, and this is kind of the go-to de facto arrangement. In talking with candidates who are looking at calls that are in these kind of shared leadership arrangements, it's a really hard time to get them to say yes to these kinds of arrangements. Mainly because as the candidate and the pastor, they look at it and they say, why would I want to, for less money, go to 2 council meetings, 2 worship committee meetings, it's duplication instead of simplification of ministry. And so it becomes harder for the office or for the pastor or the candidate to be able to say yes to these kinds of things, because oftentimes they feel that it's not a cohesion between the two communities, that it's literally just filling in and shepherding. So that's a word of caution about some of these arrangements out there. One thing that we have found with shared leadership arrangements that does sometimes work better is when it's a team of pastors shepherding multiple congregations. So we find this in Southwest Synod, where 2 or 3 pastors or a pastoral team is shepherding 5 or 6 congregations. This also gets out of the whole dynamic of jealousy between the 2 congregations. Oftentimes when people are in a shared leadership arrangement, they'll do that. Well, they're always over at the other congregation and they don't care about us, right? So we have to attend to those dynamics between the 2 congregations so that everybody feels that it's fair and equitable across the congregations. And then the other example of shared leadership that I often find out there, and we have examples of this in Upper Bucks, is a pastor serving across denominational lines. So we are blessed in the ELCA to have full communion agreements with the Episcopal Church, the United Methodist Church, the Reformed churches, the Presbyterian Church, and the UCC and Moravians. So we are blessed that we have theological arrangements and agreements with these partner denominations that our leaders can serve in their churches and their leaders can serve in our churches, to include presiding at the table, which is kind of a radical notion. That's something that has happened since 1997, that we've begun to become full communion partners with some of these denominations. So that's another way that we can create communities, because a lot of us in the more rural areas of the synod don't necessarily have another Lutheran church next to us, but we might have a Presbyterian, or we might have a Methodist, or we might have a UCC. Especially in Upper Bucks, there's an awful lot of UCC community and Reformed communities that are in that neck of the woods. So those are options with shared leadership. Now, the next kind of example that I find is what I call shared ministry. Now, this is when it's not just we're sharing the pastor back and forth, but we remain complete and separate entities, but we're beginning to take those steps towards being able to do things together um, in more and more formal agreements. So for some of our communities, that might look like sharing some of our ministries together. So doing a joint confirmation, or doing joint choirs, or doing a joint stewardship campaign, or doing joint service days together. Anywhere where we can spark collaboration between the two congregational systems is a way that we begin to share programming and shared resources between the two. It may even look in some places like an example of being able to share a secretary across the congregations. Maybe there's just one newsletter that gets produced, or one bulletin between the two worship services. So that could be an example. Then the next step with that kind of shared ministry arrangement is what I call the parish model. So this is where we actually take steps to formally put structures of administration in place between two congregational systems. So each congregation retains their own council, but perhaps there's a parish council that oversees both congregations, and that the pastor is actually called to that parish, and the parish has 2 or 3 member congregations in it. But every congregation continues to keep their own sandboxes and their own toys, but the pastor then oversees the administration across all 3 or 4 congregations in a place. But that is usually put in place with a formal kind of agreement and is brought before Synod Council. So I put on there 2 examples of those arrangements happening in other synods. I think one of them is Upper Susquehanna, and maybe one of them is, I forget where. Oh, United Lutheran Parish is up in New England. So those are 2 relatively new formalized parish agreements. And then, oh, sorry, no, United Lutheran Parish is Western Pennsylvania, I think. Sorry, because Grace Ministries is up in Worcester. So this is what we call a yoked congregation. So they have actually made steps to yoke the 2 congregations together, possibly with a new name. This is not quite merger just yet, but it is potentially the steps towards a merger of some kind between the 2 congregations. Often in yoked congregations, each is still worshiping in 2 sites, and they often find different giftedness for being in 2 sites, but that all of their other pieces are starting to become combined into one for things. The next example, and this is a relatively new way for helping congregations a little bit, has been a model of doing ministry that we call Anchor Church. And an Anchor Church is a movement among larger congregations across the ELCA that I lovingly says has 2 different flavors. One flavor is mergers and acquisitions, and much like larger corporations taking over smaller mom and pop shops, that's exactly kind of what they do, is that it's a larger congregation taking on a secondary site. And so an example of that would be Christ in Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte's downtown campus is their prominent one, but they have 4 or 5 other satellite congregations. And the pastors all serve on a team of ministry that works together across all the different ministry sites. But they have picked up 2 congregations as a process of a part of being the Anchor Church. Now, the second model of Anchor Church that I find a little bit better, and is the one that we're using here in our synod, is the model of accompaniment. And this is where a maybe more researched and more gifted congregation comes alongside another congregation for a period of time to infuse them with giftedness. So they're helping them clarify their mission or their values, or help them rethink the ways that they actively engage in their community, by supporting them as they focus on getting this sense of vitality infused into their community. So they journey with them for a little while, and then they separate and go on to another congregation to partner with them for a little bit. But it's maybe a model of helping to kind of see how we might be able to partner congregations together through this. Now, the third realm of things would be in continuing that story after yoking, and that looking at merging congregations together. Now, I know in our area we have a sordid history, especially because we live in close proximity to a heavily Catholic area, where mergers are decided from the top down, and you're told to consolidate. And that's not necessarily something that we in the Lutheran Church tend to believe is something that is a reality for us. But there are congregations who have started those conversations with other congregations and have come together over time. In fact, as I started to prepare for this, it was kind of surprising to me because I reminded myself that there are congregations who have done this over time. And so think about Christ Ascension Lutheran Church in Chestnut Hill in Philadelphia is the merger between Christ and Ascension. But that has happened a long time ago, and we forgot that that actually happened because Christ Ascension has been functioning as one community for a while now. Another place where that happened was the University UniLu. So University City Lutheran Church of the Incarnation is a combination between University City Lutheran Church and the Church of the Incarnation in West Philadelphia. And when they merged, they became the University Lutheran Church of the Incarnation. And so that's a merged congregation that has been there. So in many ways, that's what I call retaining the past. So there are semblances of what used to be that are still part of what is there now, be it a name, be it a building, be it paraments or worship furnishings. Then the other thing that often happens when a merger happens is it's the creation of something completely new. So both predecessor communities close, but the remnants of those resources, so often the congregations will sell off both buildings and come together with new resources, a new name, and a new location. But that is, all in the spectrum of things to consider when we're looking at merging and consolidating congregations together. Because the truth is some of these buildings have so much deferred maintenance that it's just not financially feasible to make them viable entities anymore. Or maybe there is a gifted community that has been blessed to be able to maintain their building, that is the better building to retain moving forward as the community finds a home for doing ministry. So then the final spectrum of ministry here is what I'm calling the alternative leadership models. So this would be communities that are served by what are generally non-traditional pastoral roles. So again, institutional church has said full-time pastor is the model for what a pastorate is supposed to look like. But in the grand history of Christianity, the office of pastor and how that functions has widely varied over time. And so one example of somebody that, Jeff picks up in his book is the example of the bivocational pastor, where, their full-time vocation is working a job outside of the parish. And that has its blessings and curses. Blessings meaning that it puts them in arenas that, I in my full-time work, I'm largely here in the building and out in our community seldom. But if I had a full-time job working outside of here, I'd be out in the community a lot more, creating a lot more of those contact points out in the community for people to come in contact with your church. And so there are examples of folks who have done that in the work of the church as well. We also could potentially look at examples like what they're doing in Upper Susquehanna Synod with lay authorized worship leaders, where there are folks who have giftedness to lead these communities that would be authorized by the synod and supervised in some kind of way as they help communities function. Jeff has examples of Episcopal churches up in Vermont that use this as an example. In fact, they have a different preacher every week, which for their community, it works because it gives them a depth and breadth to preaching that they otherwise wouldn't experience. And they find that a giftedness for their communities. And then the other example would be to partner with our synods and become a teaching parish or teaching place where a seminarian would serve in a community for a period of time as their backdrop for learning as they're going through seminary. I've long said that this is, I think, a very viable trade school modeled pattern for forming pastors in the reality of this is what a congregation is, and these are the people that you're called to serve, rather than putting them in a classroom far removed from the people that they have been called to serve, so that they are getting to know the realities of ministry. Because oftentimes we find our seminaries develop in a way that is not always as connected to the congregational system as it could be. So that is another example, and they're doing that out in Lower Susquehanna Synod as an example for what a teaching parish could look like. So those are kind of the spectrum of options that are out there. Again, this is an area, as Jeff pointed out in his book, that hasn't been researched a whole lot. And so there's not a lot of stuff out there that's teaching us about what this ministry looks like. But I'm hopeful that we're here today because we're not alone, and that we might be able to kind of think about ways that we could begin to help congregations claim this as a vital way for them to continue to do mission and ministry in the 21st century. So I thank you all for your time. I look forward to our conversations on Saturday. And at that time, we can continue this, because this has been the weirdest part of doing this. Is Vitality is all about relationships. And as much as I've enjoyed the relationship I've had with my webcam this year, I am deeply excited to have conversations with all of you and hear your stories and your wonderings and your hopings, and ways that we can continue to help create and cultivate communities of Jesus that nurture life-changing relationships with God, each other, and the world. God bless you all.